All right, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I did get to talk to a National Farmers Union in Ontario once. I think it was about 12, 13 years ago, and that was a great pleasure. So I was asked to talk a little bit about some of my reflections coming from the world of fair trade. I've been researching and working on fair trade for about 25 years. I've also looked at all kinds of other sort of market regulatory mechanisms, you might call it, over the years. I've done work on the International Coffee Agreement, on the Canadian Wheat Board. I did some work for a time on the LCBO in Ontario, a banana agreement out of the Caribbean I did some work on. And I've generally looked at state policy when it comes to trade. Recently, I'm doing work on trade and trade policy, and in particular, I'm looking at all kinds of mechanisms that have been sort of added on to trade agreements, environmental, gender, labor, Indigenous rights, human rights accords that are being added on to trade agreements. Most of those are pretty token, but some of them have actually had some pretty interesting impacts. So I've worked a lot on coffee, and I've worked in particular on fair trade coffee, and that's interesting, I think, for us to think about in this forum. Coffee is generally produced for an international market as a commodity. There's domestic markets, of course, where coffee is grown. Brazil is the world's second largest coffee consuming country, as well as the world's largest producer of coffee. And of course, coffee has many uses, it has many values. Many of us in Canada can't imagine the morning without it. It's the most consumed beverage in Canada after tap water. But it's not particularly, it has no nutritional value, certainly nothing compared to fresh fruit or vegetables. And yet it's grown by 25 million coffee farmer families across the world. It's shipped all over the world, lots of energy and emissions, and most of all, a lot of hard work and knowledge on the part of coffee farmers go into that coffee bean. But it's a commodity. So there's always been a tension here in that fair trade world around fair trade coffee and food sovereignty. If you reflect a little bit on the communities that grow our coffee, at least 70% of them, but in fair trade communities in particular, if we think about fair trade, there's over 830,000 fair trade coffee farmer families in this world. They're organized into cooperatives. They generally grow under agroecological conditions. They have all kinds of conditions in their growing. There's a minimum guaranteed price. They have social premiums that they use for community projects. There's all kinds of social and environmental standards that go into their coffee, from human rights and gender rights and migrant labor rights, child labor. And alongside their coffee, many of those small farmers grow other crops. So as a result, and I'm not the first to say this, there are those that say projects like fair trade are very much about food sovereignty. And a lot of the farmers I've met in my life would agree. It's about preserving and protecting their livelihoods as farmers, as best as they can in an imperfect world. Even when that involves exporting coffee beans halfway around the world. They work under imperfect conditions. That's something, of course, economists might talk about, but it's something I've used a lot in my own thinking over the years. The imperfect is really all we have. I don't think we should run from that. We need to accept it and realize that the goals of food sovereignty must emerge from within those imperfect conditions. We have to have a certain kind of flexibility when we think about food sovereignty, adjust as necessary, and approach difficult challenges sideways, seeing what the political conditions of the time offer us and build food sovereignty out of that, I would argue. So that comes not just from my work on fair trade, but it comes from my own reflections on trade and trade justice over many decades now. In particular, I did some work with Eastern Caribbean banana farmers from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And starting in the 1950s, there was a preferential agreement out of Europe that basically gave Caribbean banana farmers preferential access to the EU market. Basically saved a small portion of that market for Caribbean banana farmers. And out of that, you had a relatively thriving banana industry of smallholder farmers. They weren't rich or anything like that, but they had a good life. A good life in the banana industry, let's put it that way. And that came to an end in the 1990s and in the 2000s, when a series of World Trade Organization disputes basically didn't fully eliminate the agreement, but crushed its effectiveness. The US and Latin American countries basically took Europe and the Caribbean to the World Trade Organization, and they lost. And that was devastating. And the banana farmers tried in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to adjust to more local agriculture to grow for their small local markets and the regional banana market, but they couldn't make up for the loss of that export market. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, when I was doing my research from 1992 to 2019, their banana farmers declined by 99%. Let me see if I have time for that. I also looked a little bit at the Canadian Wheat Board, by the way, which was also the world's most, I would say, the 20th century's most successful modern state trading enterprise. And it was, ended by the Harper government in 2012. The Wheat Board didn't involve quotas. Not many people know that. It was just basically collectively marketing farmers' wheat to the world and domestically. It used this leverage for quality and higher prices. And it's a compelling model, I would argue, to learn from, even though it was aimed predominantly, not entirely, at exports. And in its wake, wheat farmers have declined. So in Canada today, and this is what I do a lot of my work on nowadays, we find ourselves once again under highly imperfect conditions. We have a global economy that's sort of held hostage to the unpredictable political whims of the US president. He's adding tariffs and threatening tariffs, then removing tariffs, changing his mind, adding them again. This includes the US's largest trading partners, Mexico, Canada, China, and the EU. Canada and Mexico have been somewhat actually protected from some of these tariffs because despite what it looks like on paper, so Canada on paper has a 35% tariff, but much of our goods flow through the Canadian-United States-Mexico agreement, what we used to call NAFTA. And so they don't have that tariff applied. That's not true for steel and aluminum, which are suffering, softwood lumber, which is suffering, energy and potash. Auto parts, if the auto parts are made in Canada, there's a tariff on it. If they're made in the US, it goes back and forth across the border, then it doesn't. That's really hurting the auto industry. Sales of parts and cars are down by 25% from last year. And there's other tensions created here. As I'm sure many of us know, Canada slapped a 100% tariff on EV vehicles from China, partly to try to please the US. That has backfired. China has a 76% tariff on canola seed right now, and 100% tariff on canola oil, meal, and peas. 25% on fish and seafood. So I think we have to ask ourselves, well, officially Trump is doing this, officially, to defend US industry and workers. It's an American first strategy. It's one that comes with tax cuts to the rich, major spending cuts for healthcare, science, clean energy, food supports, no clear industrial strategy, no real labor plan, and of course, more than no climate protections. But I think this is an interesting moment again to consider the domestic and the international. And I've often argued in my work that it's really not about domestic versus trade. It's about how we produce food domestically and how we trade internationally. I think we can do both with an eye towards food sovereignty. So if I think of the Canadian context today, I just have 4 quick reflections. One of them is, I think we need to try and defend Canadian market access, whether it's to the US or China, for now. I don't think we should assume it's realistic that you can put a hard brake on 35 years of global market expansion. There's a lot of farmers and other industries that rely on trade. You can't just put a hard stop to that. Our dependence has increased too much. And I think, again, that's not just with the US, it's also true with, say, China. 67% of our canola exports go to China. That creates a dependence. But my second point is, of course, we do need to promote food sovereignty domestically and strengthen our domestic agricultural market, which obviously everybody in this room is well aware of. The US provides 60% of our vegetables, 37% of our fruit. That has to change. We have to have a shift in thinking and policy. And that means thinking not just short term, but long term. shaping agricultural policy with an eye even towards our national security interests. So I recently co-authored an article with Karen Foster, Alicia Martin, and Kathleen Keaveney on Canadian agriculture as national security for the conversation. And the argument is that we need to actually strengthen our domestic production, our processing, our distribution, and our infrastructure, and strengthen our connections with local markets, between farmers and local food markets, for food sovereignty and for national security, for a real vision of what national security would involve. And there's some interesting Scandinavian countries that have done that. I think we can also connect to the current moment in some other ways. We can ask questions about processing and distribution. The food and beverage processing in Canada is our largest manufacturing sector. 65% of our manufacturing GDP and 17% of our manufacturing jobs are in the food and beverage industry. So there's many things obviously the government could do in this area. I'm not going to start laying out a laundry list of ideas. They could encourage and support more independent grocers. And in fact, the Competition Bureau recently raised this issue. As many of us know, there are 3 giant grocery chains, Loblaws, Sobeys, and Metro, that report $100 billion in sales last year and $3.6 billion in profits. So that kind of monopoly can be broken. We can have stronger efforts to promote domestic processing, even in cases, and this is, I think, interesting for us to think about, where supply chains are globalized amongst larger companies with these complicated global supply chains. And I'll just anecdotally give you an example from someone I know, Fernando Mello, from the Canadian Renewable Energy Association. They've struggled with that because you may not know this, but most of the wind turbines you're going to have in Canada, most of that will come, component parts, all that technology will come from China or other places in the world, but certainly not from Canada. And it's the same thing with our solar panels. You're not going to see any of that manufacturing or technology, or very little of it, coming from Canada. And they've struggled with how to increase the domestic content of those kind of globalized supply chains. And they've come up with some really interesting ideas. They have what they call the domestic content adder, which is something they're lobbying the government heavily for, which proposes a 10% tax credit for companies that reach a certain threshold of domestic production in Canada. And as a final thought, I think it's interesting to think of the way food can also connect to our wider needs around climate change and mitigation beyond the ones I'm sure everybody in this room already knows around agroecological and organic practices. And one example, just as food for thought, that I've been working on is on our fertilizer, our nitrogen. The National Farmers Union wrote a report on this 3 years ago, on nitrogen fertilizer that is made with ammonia. Around 40 to 50% of the world's population depends directly on food produced with nitrogen fertilizer. But it also accounts for 1% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. So this fertilizer produces more emissions every year than all of Brazil. 95% of the production, the emissions that come from production of ammonia fertilizer, can actually be abated if we change the hydrogen source and switch to green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is made with renewable energy, and it's more costly. But the shift could be made with the right government policies. Canada could be a leader. Right now, we're a laggard. And the Hydrogen Council recently estimates that if for an additional 1 to 3% additional cost on the final product for some agriculture products, you can abate the emissions by 30%. It depends on what product. So bread, for example, for an additional 1% on the cost of bread, you can abate the emissions by 10%. With canola, you can abate it by 30% if you switch to green ammonia. So I think this is, once again, government needs to have the right support, the right subsidies, the right regulations to get these mechanisms in place, including ones that put the burden of the cost on the big companies. So I think my final thought is I'm just going to reflect by saying that when I reflect on the political dimensions of food sovereignty today, I would suggest that the goal is not strictly about domestic versus traded food, but about how we produce, process, and distribute food in all cases, emphasizing solidarity both locally and globally. Thank you.